am so pleased and feel that we are very privileged to have the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas with us for today. And Dr. Douglas is Canon Theologian at Washington National Cathedral, the former Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, the winner of the prestigious Grawemeyer Award in Religion. So that's like the Nobel Peace Prize of religion. That's what I like to call it. And also, she's the author of numerous books, including Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, and Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. And I realized that I did not include in these notes that she's also a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School right now. And so she's going to lead us in conversation about being the church when our very humanity is at stake. So clearly that's a big topic. That's why you're going to need to take notes. And with all of that, I'm just going to sit down and let her go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bishop Shannon, for your ministry and for your invitation to me today to share with your diocese. Thank you, Dean Greta, for your hospitality and your welcome here. And I have to thank Jenny, who I guess also brought the snacks, but stood out in the cold or whatever and waited for me, my bus to arrive, and it was such a warm welcome to the diocese. And I thank you all. I always like the applause beforehand because, you know, after it's like, oh. That's okay, that's okay. So yes, so let's begin because I do want to talk about what it means to be church. For we come together on this day, 4 days after what for some has been an unsettling election season, asking the question, what does it mean to be church? What indeed does it mean to be church? That is, what does it mean for us to carry forth the gospel mission in these polarizing, warring, and dehumanizing times? Ours is a time marked by not just divide and conquer politics, but of disparaging and destroying those with whom we politically and ideologically disagree, leaving us in many respects anxious, fearful, and dispirited. It is indeed the case that enmity and derision seem to be the watchwords of our time, where we not only dislike certain viewpoints, but we all too often dislike the people who hold those views. It is what some have called affective polarization, an emotional, almost visceral response to those we see as our political opponents. They become our enemies. As one observer put it, in these fractured and polarized times of ours, filled with rhetoric more inflammatory, the rage is more likely to curdle into hate. It's ugly out there, he says. What does it mean for us to be church, carrying forth the gospel mission in these our warring times, defined by terroristic bigotry and genocidal devastation? In this our time where more than 1,200 Israelis were murdered and 240 civilian hostages taken during the Hamas attack in Israel of October 7th, a year ago, and where 1 year later over 100 men, women, and children are still being held hostage, even as anti-Semitism is on the rise, what does it mean for us to be church? What does it mean to carry forth our defining gospel mission when more than 4,100 Palestinians have been killed since the more than 12-month war in Gaza, with most of those killed being women and children, even as anti-Palestinian bigotry and Islamophobia is on the rise. What does it mean to be church? Carrying forth the gospel mission when, in the words of our Archbishop Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, when he says such immense suffering is allowed to continue forgotten by most of the world. For ours is a world where Sudan, says African expert Michelle Gavin, is on the precipice of a horrifying humanitarian disaster. Last month, United Nations experts issued a statement warning that Sudan faces one of the worst famines in decades. According to the statement, a staggering 97% of Sudan's internally displaced persons and civilians who remain in their own homes are facing severe levels of hunger. As of July of this year, nearly 19,000 people have been killed, while around 33,000 people have been injured in the fighting, and the number of people displaced or in need of critical humanitarian assistance is in the tens of millions. At least 700,000 Sudanese children are suffering severe malnutrition. What does it mean for us to be church in the face of such ignored suffering? What does it mean to be church in this time that all but accepts the ongoing dehumanizing assaults against LGBTQ plus and gendered expansive human beings? In our country, the assaults against LGBTQ plus persons has been virtually accepted as the stuff of politics and normal policymaking. The American Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking over 500 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in the U.S. It further reports that since 2020, over 100 bills attacking transgender human beings have been introduced into state legislatures. Needless to say, these bills are not benign. They have real life and death consequences for real human beings, especially for LGBTQ plus youth. Various studies have reported a correlation between these bills and anti-LGBTQ plus school bullying and hate crimes. Police reported school hate crimes doubled nationwide, with an even steeper rise in states that have passed laws curbing the rights of transgender students at schools and restricting how teachers can talk about issues of gender and sexuality. Policy sets the tone for real-world experiences, and discriminatory policy just creates a hostile environment, said Amy McGee, a researcher of LGBTQ plus health and well-being. And how, Diocese of Vermont, do we carry forth the church's defining gospel mission in a time when the vitriolic spectacle of hatred and racism that is white supremacy promises to leave no generation unscathed? As just yesterday, Black college students, along with other Black youth nationwide, were sent racist texts that have been described as frighteningly personal and harrowing. And then there is, that's not enough, Christian nationalism. How are we to be church in this our time, when the bigotry and xenophobia that is Christian nationalism has become a prominent and aggressive narrative in our public square and political agenda, compromising the integrity of Christianity itself? And so, yes, the question we are asking today, and indeed the one that we must ask, is what does it mean to be church carrying forth the gospel mission in these dividing, disquieting, dehumanizing times of ours? What does it mean to be church? Inasmuch as the church's essential mission is fundamentally about spreading the gospel, and it is, then to be church means working for a lasting peace, the peace that is God's. Such a divine peace is about more than the cessation of war, the absence of disagreement and tension, the cessation of conflict, or even the presence of civility and conciliation. Indeed, the measure of a lasting peace, that is the peace of God's, hinges on the existence of justice. In this regard, a lasting peace, divine peace, is a just peace. This is the peace that is the justice of God. Therefore, to be church, carrying forth the gospel mission is to foster a just peace. Simply put, the defining mission of the church, that which being church hinges on, is the work of just peacemaking. Now, no doubt some of you are thinking, oh, that sounds good. But what does it mean? And for sure, it's easier said than done. What does just peacemaking look like? What is required of us as a people who claim to be church to live in to that claim? I believe that fostering a just peace requires at least two fundamental paradigm shifts. Stay with me for a minute. The first is an intentional and profound shift in how we understand mission. The second is a profound shift in how we conceive of violence. A rethinking of both is essential to realizing the work and thus the ultimate goal of the church's mission. Again, that is of forging a just peace. So let me begin by first turning to the importance of rethinking Christian mission. This is what we know. Historically, a conversion paradigm has defined our understanding of Christian mission. As such, the overall aim of the missionary project within this paradigm was about converting people, commonly referred in some instances historically as heathens, converting people to the faith and practices of Christianity. Such conversion became virtually synonymous with socializing and assimilating people into a particular way of living and thinking. Essentially, conversion to Christianity meant conversion to the culture and subjugation to the missional aggressors, which were typically the people in power, be it globally or domestically. Such a conversion paradigm characteristically disrespected the indigenous religions of the missional targets, their way of life, their values, let alone their humanity and their non-human resources. This conversion paradigm essentially made victims of those who were to be converted. The missionary project essentially landed upon a people and their land, at once betraying their humanity and exploiting their land. In the end, mission success within this conversion paradigm was measured by the missionary's victim subservience to the religion, the culture, ways, and whims of the missionary aggressors. Now, perhaps needless to say, this conversion paradigm was that which provided easy theological legitimation, that is, a Christian sacred canopy, for the exploitation, enslavement, if not extermination, of various peoples, namely non-white persons. It is also worth noting that the legacy of this model can be seen today in the various manifestations of white Christian nationalism that are present across the globe, including the white Christian nationalism that is enacted on the public political arena here in the United States. The point of the matter is that this conversion paradigm of mission, in whatever forms it might take, is antithetical to what it means to carry forth the gospel mission. it is not about, the gospel mission is not about making Christians of people and bringing them into our churches and places of worship. Rather, it is about forging a just peace and therefore bringing the justice that is God's heaven into our earthly living. And so it is in this way that this conversion model of mission is also antithetical to our very baptismal covenant that calls us to, and I quote it, strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. In the end, this conversion mission paradigm, as we will see later, is violent and as such perpetuates violence. It is the missionary culprit that fosters the kind of polarizing, divisive, and dehumanizing times in which we find ourselves. And thus, the fundamental imperative for us is that if we are to live into our claim of being church, is to intentionally and purposefully rethink, if not redefine, the meaning of our Christian mission. We'll talk about that a little further in terms of congregations. So this brings me to what I call a liberative paradigm of mission. A liberative paradigm of mission is defined not by converting people to Christianity and thus to the religion and culture of the missional aggressors. Rather, it is defined by liberating, that is, freeing people from whatever it is that prevents them from living into the just future that God promises and desires for God's world and for God's people. In the words of our former presiding Bishop Curry, this is a future where all are loved, he says, where justice is done, and where the God-given equality of all is honored. A liberative model of mission is about the promise we make in our baptismal covenant. Again, the promise to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. This is what just peacemaking looks like. This is the defining mission of the church. True Christian mission, therefore, is not about thrusting a particular culture and way of life or even religion, including Christianity, onto a people. To the contrary, it is about fostering God's just future and doing the work, therefore, of God. In theological terms, it is about the Missio Dei, that is the mission of God. Properly understood, therefore, Christian mission is not a response to governments or institutions sending us in the world to spread our religion and way of life, making, if you will, good citizens, good Americans, therefore good Christians. No, Christian mission is a response to God's eternal mission to create and cultivate a loving and just world, a world characterized by a just peace. And so it is that inasmuch as the church's primary mission is about spreading the gospel, because it is about nothing less than making real the good news of God's just future in our very present. Thus, as agents of God's mission, we are to be accountable not to human demands, that is, to the politics of human beings, but rather we are to be accountable to the call of God, might we say, the politics of God. As such, we are called to liberative work, liberating the places where we find ourselves from that which stands in the way of a just peace. It is in this way that true Christian mission, that is the gospel mission of the church, while not violent, is unavoidably disruptive. So this brings me to the second aspect of being church, rethinking violence. Johann Galtung, who's the pioneer of peace studies, is helpful in this regard. Galtung, and I should spell his name because I'm probably mispronouncing it, is Galtung. Anyway, he aptly points out, it's very helpful, that violence is that which is an insult to life. Translating that into theological terms, violence is anything that harms or devalues the life that God has granted us all. Now, Galtung goes on to point out that violence is carried out in at least 3 interrelated ways. I promise you at some point we'll have time to discuss this so you can ask questions. I'm throwing a lot at you this morning, all right? But this is important. This is the way it functions. Violence is carried out in at least 3 ways: directly, structurally, and culturally. Direct violence is best understood, as Galtung might say, an event, such as war, such as famine, or any kind of aggressive, what we might call violent act that poses a direct, if not immediate threat to life. The stratum of direct violence, Galtung says, is reflected in the cruelty perpetuated by human beings against each other and against other forms of life and nature in general. The cruelty perpetuated, that's direct violence. Now, if direct violence is an event, structural violence is, as Galtung reminds us, a process with its ups and downs that creates insidious and systemic patterns of exploitation, inequality, marginalization, oppression, and just overall injustice. Structural violence, right? Then lastly, cultural violence. Galtung describes it as the symbolic sphere of our existence. Put this way, it is the language, that is the art, that is religion. As such, cultural violence is about a slow transformation process that ultimately distorts our thinking and corrupts our moral imaginary. Now watch this. It does so in such a way that it makes direct violence and structural violence appear and feel right, or at least not wrong, right? Cultural violence in the end renders direct and structural violence acceptable. It normalizes the violence that is bigotry, that is xenophobia, that is racism, that is assaults against LGBTQ plus persons. Now, y'all still with me for a minute? Now, it is with an appreciation of direct, structural, and cultural violence that we can readily recognize the way in which any form or legacy of a conversion missionary model is a violent perpetuator of violence itself. As a missionary model focused on converting people to a particular religion and thus way of life with little or no regard for their indigenous religions or way of life, it is at base, these conversion models of mission are at base culturally violent. Historically, in as much as this conversion model, like, converting people to Christianity, was intrinsically culturally violent, as pointed out earlier, this conversion model of mission served to legitimate and render acceptable the multidimensional structural violence of, for instance, the slavocracy, as well as the direct violence perpetrated against the bodies of other people, such as the enslaved, such as the indigenous, indigenous peoples of our country, and others. Cultural violence renders them non-persons, right? A conversion model is an example of cultural violence. It also, of course, as we know, legitimated the extermination of various peoples. The mantra used to be with this kind of missionary project is, if you can't assimilate them, then exterminate them. That's true. It was the motto. It is in this way that a conversion paradigm of mission, and we can think about the ways in which we carry forth such a model. It is in this way that it is the productive, legitimating core, of the direct structural cultural web of violence. It provides a sacred canopy over the multidimensional interlocking realities of violence. And we should be clear that Christian nationalism today is nothing less than a sacred canopy for the direct, structural, and cultural violence that is white supremacy with its contingent realities of misogyny and LGBTQ+ bigotry. And so it is that a liberative paradigm of mission is essential to stopping the violence that characterizes our present and thus crucial to fostering the just peace that is the gospel good news of God, and thus is critical to what it means for us to be church. And again, this is consonant with our baptismal covenant as we proclaim that we will persevere in resisting evil. That a liberative, not conversion paradigm of mission is the essence of the church's identity and mission, and is at the center of our baptismal covenant, is made clear through none other than Jesus. Made clear in his life and ministry. He summarized what it meant for him to be the incarnate reality of God's work in the world this way. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And so what does it mean for us to carry forth in this our present world the liberative work that is the church's mission? To reiterate, it means stopping the violence, which is essential to just peacemaking. But now what really does this look like? Right? I saw that question on your face. What are the missional tasks, if you will, when it comes to Christian mission? How can we put this into practice? First and foremost, to carry forth the gospel mission means that we must stop and ask ourselves a serious question. Are we willing to accept the challenge of being church, or are we content with being a social institution that happens to be religious? It is easy to follow into the routine of being a religiously identified social institution. Before we know it, our time and energy is spent in the internal debates about authority or prayer book language or budget. I know none of that sounds familiar. Essentially, whether as a diocese, as congregations, or as a denomination, we find ourselves too easily turned inward, trying to shore up the institution itself and our places within it. Yet, to be church is to turn outward, doing the work of God in the world. Put simply, to be church is about making the mission of the gospel our primary work. And thus, in all that we do, it should be about providing a sure and certain foundation so that we can do that work. And so now what does that work look like? To do the work of the church that is the gospel mission requires that we engage our work from the perspective of those whose lives and life conditions have been harmed by the multi-layered legacy of a conversion mission model and thus the multi-dimensional realities of violence. In terms of mission, this means that rather than landing upon a people, a liberative mission project listens and learns from a people, listens and learns from those on the underside of justice, those who have been made to suffer under the weight of the intersecting realities of direct structural and cultural violence, those perhaps on the outside of our churches who are oftentimes ignored and forgotten. And this brings me back to this matter of violence itself. Far too often, if we are honest, violence itself has been understood from the perspective of those who carry forth, right? Colonizing sort of white supremacist legacy. In other words, from the perspective of the powerful and dominant classes in our world, in our society. Consequently, outcries to stop the violence, even from the church, typically only emerge in response to the direct violence of those that are victims of the multidimensional realities of violence in the first place. It is when they are pushed to acts of violence in an effort to set themselves free from what I call crucifying violence that has engulfed their lives. It is then that we hear the outrage and the self-righteous indignation about the scourge of violence. We have to be clear, if we are to be church, that violence breeds violence. It is rarely the victims of violence who are the perpetuators of violence. The direct violence that erupts from those who are subjugated and oppressed is invariably the violence that violence has created. And so, if the church's mission is to stop the violence, then the outrage must be directed at the precipitating violence at our cultural and structural injustice. This is the violence that is poverty, with its comorbidities of indecent housing, lack of educational, employment, healthcare, and recreation opportunities. This is the violence that is an occupied country or land. This is the violence that is famine and food insecurity. This is the violence that is xenophobia, bigotry, anti-LGBTQ plus terrorism, and more. If we are going to stop the violence, then the church's mission is to stop that violence. Furthermore, inasmuch as a liberative missionary project centers the perspective of the victims, and it should, it must also hear from them about how this complex interplay of direct structural and cultural violence is an insult to their life and how it truly impacts their living. Essentially, the fundamental task of the church's mission is not to assume what living under such violent realities means, but rather to learn from its victims the multi-nefarious impact of such violence on their lives, and thus what freedom from such violence would actually look like for them. How often is it that good Christians, as we are, go into situations assuming what is best for those who suffer, and what it is that they need? We carry forth global missionary projects doing that. And then we all, I'm talking to myself, then we get mad when the recipients of our missionary goodwill reject what it is we are offering, accusing them of being ungrateful. I know the only person in the room that's ever done that is me. As someone once said to me, They brought us coats, but we did not need coats. We did not ask for coats. They should have asked us what we needed first. The point is, as I have said many times before, that it is only when those who have been on the underside of justice began to experience the freedom that is justice, it is only then that we will know that we are on the ark of the gospel good news, that is a justice defined by a just peace. It is only then that we will know that we are on our way to being church, on our way of fulfilling the gospel call to us. This brings me to another task of the liberative missionary project: resisting and protesting that which stands in opposition to all that diminishes or negates the opportunity for persons to grow into the fullness of whomever they have been created to be, and thus prevents them from enjoying the abundance of life that God promises us all. Just peacemaking is found in the ways in which people advocate for and foster the abundance of life that is God's, to be shared by all. Just peacemaking, therefore, means creating spaces of freedom, equity, and empathy for those who have been denied that in our world, in our society, and even within our religious institutions. To foster the just peace that is God's desired future for us is to work to repair the breach between our unjust, violent present and God's just future. Now, I'm almost there, but this brings us to perhaps which is often called the sticky wicket aspect of the liberative mission model to just peacemaking, and that is navigating the political landscape. How often do we hear that the church's role is not to engage in the politics of our day? But here is the thing. There is no neutrality when it comes to injustice. Let me say that again. There is no neutrality when it comes to injustice. And thus, while we are not called to be politically partisan, to spread the good news of the gospel is to be partisan when it comes to the values of God. These are values that foster justice. They are values that preserve, cherish, respect, and enhance the dignity and worth of every single solitary human being without exception. The values that undergird just peacemaking are those that liberate people to live into the best of their humanity, as opposed to values that betray the sacred humanity of us all. In the end, a liberative mission paradigm invariably means that we must be politically engaged. And by the way, we have a model for that. Oh, that guy Jesus. When Jesus said he came to preach good news to the poor and proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, guess what? He meant it. And so it was that while he didn't endorse any particular political or religious party of his day, he was political as he carried out the values of the gospel good news, as he empathized with the sick, with the poor and the marginalized, healed them and restored them to new life at the same time that he stood firmly against those principalities and powers which were an affront to the dignity of every human being and thus an affront to the kingdom of God. Jesus' mission was his life. And as I have often said, Jesus wasn't crucified because he prayed too much. He was crucified because he was political, standing against that which was an anathema to the values of God as he stood for that which reflected God's just future. Archbishop Welby put it this way, and I quote him at length at this. He said, Jesus was never party political. No wing of politics, left or right, can claim God as being on its side. But Jesus, Archbishop Welby says, was highly political. He told the rich that, unlike the poor who were blessed, they would face woes. He criticized the king as a fox. He spoke harsh words to leaders of the nations when they were uncaring for the needy. This is Jesus. He did this because God cares for those in need and expects those who claim to act in God's name to do the same. This is what it means to carry forth the gospel mission. This is what it means to be church. So this brings me, I'm sure you're glad to hear me say, to the final point. At least that I want to make for now. Diocese of Vermont, my fellow sojourners on this Christian journey. Just peacemaking must begin at home, in our own backyards, in our own churches, in our own communities, institutions, organizations. It is always easier to talk about the violent ways of others than it is to acknowledge, talk, and do something about the ways in which we are violent and complicit in the violence of others, be it wittingly or unwittingly. The liberative mission model requires that we purposefully and intentionally engage in what I call a violence just peace audit of the spaces, the institutions, the organizations, the congregations that we are a part of. What are the ways in which we foster violence and thwart the possibilities for just peace? What are the ways in which just peacemaking is a reality or not? How do the spaces we occupy, our churches, our organizations, our institutions, our dioceses, carry forth the multidimensional legacy of a conversion paradigm model of mission? What are the ways in which it is complicit in, carries forth direct structural and cultural violence? What are the ways that our various mission statements, we all have, every congregation, every church has a mission statement. What are the ways in which those mission statements reflect, wittingly or unwittingly, the residue of conversion paradigms of mission? Here's the thing. Just as Jesus, as Christ, was the incarnate reality of God's rule, of God's just future, we who claim to be followers of him, we who claim to be church, are likewise to be embodied witnesses to that very future. We got to model it. We are to be embodied models of just peace. To be church is to reflect an inbreaking of God's future in our very present. We, like Jesus, are to reflect through our person, through our congregations, through our dioceses, through all of our religious institutions. We are to reflect the already, not yet reality of God's justice in our very unjust present. If we can't model it, if we who claim to be church can't model that, then how in the world can we expect the wider world and society in which we live to reflect the justice of God? And so it is that we must do the work of turning toward ourselves and asking how it is we are or are not doing the work that is the mission of the church. It is about the repentance that we are all called to in our baptismal covenant. Will you persevere, it says, in resisting evil? And whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord? That is, return to the work that is the gospel mission. This is what doing Christian mission, that just peacemaking, is all about. It must start in our repentance. This is what it means for us to be church. So back to the beginning. Ours is a disquieting, disheartening, and disturbing time. No getting around that. That we claim to be followers of Jesus, however, means that we are compelled to rethink the way we carry forth the church's mission so that we can effectively address the violence that shapes our world, our nation, our society, our communities. And so it is, my friends, that we are not called to convert others to Jesus, but rather we are called to open ourselves to the claim of Jesus on our lives, the claim and the call of Jesus to be just peacemakers in our world. This Diocese of Vermont is what spreading the good news of the gospel is all about. And so as you gather at this convention, let us all commit ourselves to doing this work in all that we do and in all that we are, individually, collectively, institutionally, as followers of Jesus, as church. It is hard work. It does perhaps require us to turn around and to do something differently. But this is the work that our world must have. This is the work that is God's call to us. This is the work of the gospel mission. This is the work of being church. And there is no time more than this time that the world, that our people need us to be church. What does it mean to be church in times like this? It means being church. Thank you. Well, thank you, and welcome back from lunch, and thank you for coming back from lunch. I know that's not an easy thing to do, and coming back from the Great Bread Bake-Off. And I understand the winner of the Great Bread Bake-Off is the one who replaced gluten with a lot of maple and sugar and all of that. So, really, what I want us to do together this afternoon is to be in conversation, as opposed to a monologue with me. But I want to highlight a couple of things, and then want to invite you into conversation with me and through questions and et cetera. First thing I want to say is that I would say, so why are we talking about all of this today or any day? I firmly believe, and I've said it many times, that we are living in what we can theologically call a Kairos time, right? A Kairos time. And all of you know, and so I will just sort of reaffirm for this conversation what we're talking about here. We know that we can talk about Chronos time as sort of clock time, if you will. But when we talk about Kairos time, we're talking about the right time. The right time as it is God's time. Kairos time is a time that is usually filled with disruption, filled with chaos, a time of crises. And if we understand that word crises, we understand it to mean a time, yes, of opportunity. And so as Kairos time is filled with all of these things that are unsettling, Kairos times are unsettling times. But they are also times, or not but, and it's what makes it the Kairos. It is a time pregnant with the presence and possibilities of God. The question is, will we live into the Kairos or miss it? Right? It's this great document that was put out by the church in South Africa during the height of apartheid in the 80s called the Kairos document. And one of the things that they said is they talked about the Kairos time that was theirs was that if it is missed, then it is a not simply missed opportunity, but it really becomes, and I'm paraphrasing, almost a disaster for the church. This is our Kairos time. That in the midst of the dis-ease, in the midst of what some may see as crisis, in the midst of what certainly is a unsettling time, it is pregnant with the possibilities of God. Our task is to find where God is present and to partner with God in moving us toward a more just future. Which brings me to just another point that I want to make in relationship to this. I've been asked, and some of you have probably heard it asked in different settings or in things that you've read or on news, whatever, that people ask, is this a Bonhoeffer moment? Have you heard that question? Is this a Bonhoeffer moment? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you all know, right? The great Protestant theologian and ethicist who, of course, during World War II Germany, during Nazi Germany, when the church, well, it was a form of Christian nationalism. And when the institutional church provided a sacred canopy for the power of the day, which was Nazism. And so Bonhoeffer and others, moved forward with the confessing church. And we know that Bonhoeffer would, of course, eventually participate in an assassination attempt on Hitler, for which he gave his life, not Hitler, but Bonhoeffer. And so people ask, is this a Bonhoeffer moment? Well, I say this, let's back up and ask what that means, what it was that Bonhoeffer stood for, right? And Bonhoeffer centered himself, if you will, his theology, his ethics, around the cross. The cross was central for Bonhoeffer. I often say, because I think it is so, that it is so that the cross is the center, the core of our faith. A crucifixion sits at the core of our faith. So we ought to act like it. Now, what does that mean? Right? Doesn't mean, for Bonhoeffer in his day and in his time, for whatever reason, in his context, he participated in the action that he participated in. But what came before that and what drove Bonhoeffer was the confessing church, which understood that the cross was at the center. A crucifixion was at the center. So what does that mean? It's not a call into further violence. It's a way to break the cycle of violence, right? Because the cross made clear, one of the greatest theologians of our time died a couple of weeks ago, the father of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez. And no one's said it better than Gustavo Gutierrez, Catholic theologian. And when Gustavo Gutierrez says, the cross makes clear God's utter, uncompromised solidarity with the oppressed, the subjugated of our world. I say with the crucified classes of people in our time. The cross, that Jesus went to the cross, signifies God's utter solidarity with those on the underside. If we are to take that which is at the center of our faith, a crucifixion, seriously, there's no other place for the church to be but there. Because here's the thing. It is when you are on the underside of justice that you really have the preferential claim to what justice looks like. Otherwise, we tend to confuse justice with privilege, and they aren't the same thing. So, when people say, is this a Bonhoeffer moment? First of all, I say that we have to ask that question means that we have not been living into what it means to be a faith tradition with the cross at its center. It also means that every moment for us should be a Bonhoeffer moment. Not a moment to overthrow anything or to perpetuate violence, but a moment to break the cycle of violence by living into the meaning of God's utter solidarity with the oppressed and subjugated, the crucified classes in our world today. So that's the second thing that I want to lift up and to say. And then you say, so how do we get from talking about mission to having to talk about violence? think that it is the ways in which we don't understand the way in which violence functions in our world, in our society, our not understanding that is an impediment to the way forward toward justice. Because when we don't understand that, what we don't understand is the way in which people's lives are impacted by, well, the violence we do. Violence is anything that betrays or distorts our common humanity. Anything. Our common sacred humanity. And here's the thing I know to be true. Those who perpetuate violence, well, it is their humanity that is most at risk. It is their humanity that has been most distorted and betrayed. To dehumanize another says more about your humanity than it does the one whose humanity you are, in fact, negating. Right? James Baldwin spoke to that so well, but we know that to be the truth. In order to really reclaim the sacredness of our humanity, we must break the cycle of violence that we have all been caught up in. And therefore, we have to understand how it functions in our society. And sometimes, just because it doesn't look violent doesn't mean it's not violent. Because we know how it feels when someone hits you. I mean, literally hits you, right? You know, when you've been struck by that direct violence, you know how that feels. It feels the same way when you aren't hit physically, but you are hit structurally and culturally, etc. So it's so traumatizing because it's someone saying that you don't have a right to exist as you are. That's violent. It's important for the church to break the cycle of violence that distorts, corrupts, betrays, and compromises our sacred humanity. That's what's at stake. I can't say that more. Because, and I started out this place, and then I'm going to end. I started out my talk this morning this way, talking about what called sort of this effective kind of responses that we have. Here's what is this, and this is about our humanity. This is about violence. I am so puzzled at the lack of empathetic regard we have for one another. That's the seat of our humanity, to be able to see ourselves in another and another in ourselves. And if we could do that, we wouldn't harm one another the way we do. But I am shocked. I remember asking, I would see, and continue to see, I remember a couple of incidents, quote unquote, in the news, and particularly police crime on black bodies. It's like, how do they do that? That's somebody's son. That's somebody's, how do they do that? And really, I'm sitting here at my age asking that, right? I'm on the board of the Homeless Coalition in New York. And I look at homeless people in the streets, don't have anywhere to go. The first thing I think is, nobody comes into this world that I know of that says, I simply cannot wait to grow up and be homeless. I don't think that's anybody's goal. And I walk through, and I'm like, how can we do that to somebody? How is it that we can allow people to live like that? And then get all mad, right? When, we try to make efforts to provide them with housing and food and all of the other things. The lack of empathetic regard. Some have called it empathetic incapacitation. Without empathetic regard, we have lost the seeds for our humanity.